first off, I want to welcome everyone. Thanks so much to all of you for attending ICCR's 2024 Proxy Season webinar. Before we dive into the details of some really cutting-edge member initiatives, I want to take a moment to talk about the broader political context that we find ourselves in. As more and more investors and companies recognize that the management of environmental, social, and governance risks is critical to long-term sustainability, opponents have mobilized, as we've all seen, an extensive backlash to ESG with the broader goal of hampering corporate progress on climate change, DEI, and so many other important issues with systemic implications. The pushback is broad-based, it's well-organized, and it has a deep pool of funding from the same networks that for some time have been chipping away at a range of corporate accountability mechanisms. It's taken the form of state laws prohibiting companies from doing business with this, prohibiting companies doing business with the state from boycotting, quote, boycotting fossil fuels, and other state laws prohibiting state funds from ESG investing. In other words, prohibiting pension funds, which have a fiduciary duty of impartiality to future pensioners, from even considering long-term risk. State attorneys general have been issuing opinions declaring that under state law, consideration of long-term climate risk and other ESG factors in investing essentially amounts to a violation of fiduciary duty. And these same officials have been issuing subpoenas to banks, asset managers, proxy advisors, and even law firms that support the concept of investing with an ESG lens. Now Congress has gotten into the game, introducing anti-ESG legislation and issuing investigative subpoenas to investors, including some ICCR members, accusing them of antitrust violations for the same kind of thoughtful shareholder engagement that our members have practiced for decades. In addition, organizations seeking to impede investors' progress on corporate accountability to mitigate environmental and social risks are increasingly entering the corporate proxy process with their own shareholder proposals requesting the exact opposite of what our members are proposing. While these anti-ESG resolutions have gotten almost negligible support from other investors, they're still proliferating. Collectively, these forces are aggressively focused on undermining the shareholder proposal process and silencing investors' voices. For example, last summer, the National Association of Manufacturers intervened in a case against the SEC, bringing claims that would invalidate the SEC's authority over the shareholder proposal process on corporate First Amendment grounds, thanks to the Citizens United precedent. ICCR submitted an amicus brief to the Fifth Circuit supporting the SEC's authority and emphasizing the value of the shareholder proposal process, and some of our allies also filed briefs. The case is pending with a hearing on the motions on March 5th. More recently, as many of you have heard, ExxonMobil several weeks ago sued two of its shareholders, one of which is an ICCR member, to block their shareholder proposal asking the company to accelerate the pace of emissions reductions, an area, of course, of very broad concern for many investors. Even after the proponents withdrew the resolution, Exxon announced that it intends to pursue the lawsuit and will seek compensation from the proponents for any legal costs. This is essentially a slap suit meant to silence the voices of investors and intimidate other shareholders from bringing future resolutions to the company on climate risk. The unprecedented lawsuit is also a direct challenge to the SEC's authority to oversee the no-action process. Of course, all of these actions are part of the broader attack on corporate accountability by many of the same well-funded players, including the challenge in the Supreme Court, right now the Loper case, to the decades-old doctrine giving federal agencies deference to write rules, a decision which, if overturned, will put current and future rules on the environment, labor, financial abuses, and many other critical areas of public interest at risk. And this all comes in the broader, even broader context of some very real threats to democracy in this country and abroad. I raise this litany of challenges not to depress everyone, although it's really quite depressing, but rather as a call to action for all of us to double down on the critically important work that we do. Mobilization by institutional investors, working with civil society groups, labor, and other key stakeholders is desperately needed to ensure continued progress on issues that have a systemic impact on people and planet. From curbing climate change and advancing a just transition to clean energy, to protecting worker rights and human rights, to ensuring health equity, to bringing accountability to corporate political engagement, to name just a few. In short, there's a lot of work to be done, and we'll rise to the challenge collectively. If you're not already involved in these efforts, we welcome you to join us to support all of our collective work. We appreciate working closely with so many of you on this call, and I want to give a big thank you to our upcoming panelists, as well as a shout out to Julie Wackety and Susanna McDermott, who worked so hard to bring us the proxy book in this webinar. With that, again, thank you for joining us this morning, and back over to you, Susanna.
Thanks, Josh. Okay, and now to Julie Wackety, ICCR's Deputy Director of Communications and the principal author of the Proxy Guide. She's all the yeoman's work that's been done by Julie. She should be commended. She's going to provide us with a high-level overview of this year's guide. Take it away, Julie.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. The ICCR Proxy Resolutions and Voting Guide contains the full text of ICCR member-sponsored resolutions, both as lead and co-filer for 2024 proxies as of February 15th. If you are an investor, we invite you to consider these proposals as you vote your proxies. A link to download the guide and the copy of the recording will be sent to you following today's webinar. So I will take us through some of the key trends in this year's guide. ICCR members filed 345 resolutions at 215 companies. Broadly speaking, where did ICCR member interest coalesce this year? Proposals addressing worker rights and human rights and the climate crisis led the way with 75 and 71, respectively. Proposals on corporate lobbying and political spending were the third largest group with 63. Next comes diversity and racial justice, followed by corporate governance, environmental health, and health equity. With 75 proposals accounting for 22% of all member filings, shareholder resolutions related to worker rights and human rights are the most popular category this year, just ahead of climate-related proposals. 7 of these made the case for employers paying their workers a living wage. Marcela Pinilla will share more about these engagements during our webinar. One of the most effective mechanisms for promoting wage growth and securing workplace rights is collective workplace bargaining. 15 proposals this year addressed respect for freedom of association. Other proposals in this group addressed various aspects of workplace safety, including the difficult conditions faced by railroad workers and cell tower linemen, the violence faced by gig workers, and the risks gun violence poses to customers and workers in the retail sector. Investors also filed 8 proposals asking companies to conduct enhanced due diligence on the risks of doing business in conflict-affected and high-risk areas, with several focusing on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You'll hear more about this group of proposals in just a moment from Chirag Acharya. The use of artificial intelligence by large corporations raises significant social policy concerns, including mass layoffs due to job automation, the misuse and exposure of private data, and the creation of deep-fake media content that may contribute to the dissemination of false information, including campaign-related misinformation. 11 proposals this proxy season indicate sharply growing investor concern for AI's impact. Brandon Rees will explain more about investors' concerns in a moment. 2023 was the hottest year on record, and the likelihood that 2024 will be even warmer is strong. Seeking to spur transformative action to a clean energy future, ICCR's members filed 20 proposals this season in a range of industries, pressing companies to implement climate transition plans with greenhouse gas reduction goals aligned with the net zero pathway. Our members also filed 5 proposals at leading banks regarding aligning their lending with a credible net zero pathway. We also saw a new focus this year on risks related to environmental justice impacts. Pedro Enriquez da Silva will describe investors' work in this area shortly. And as the U.S. enters its 2024 presidential election cycle, companies are understandably facing intense scrutiny from their investors for deeper disclosure of their political activities. Investors asked 17 companies to disclose their election spending, and other proposals asked companies to assess the congruence of their political and electioneering expenditures with their publicly stated values and policies. Investors also continue to express concern about risks related to corporate lobbying, and this proxy season filed 36 lobbying disclosure resolutions with companies across numerous industries. Altogether, ICCR members and their allies filed 63 proposals on lobbying and political spending. And this year, ICCR members filed 17 proposals promoting health equity, several employing an explicitly human rights lens. ICCR members asked pharma companies to adopt human rights policies that include the right to the highest attainable standard of health. Laura Krause will share more about these proposals soon. Insurer United Health Group was asked to conduct a third-party audit analyzing the racial and ethnic disparities of its business model, and noting that predictive algorithms have already been used to deny some patients care. Our members also asked United to issue a transparency report explaining its use of AI in its operations. Members of the ICCR coalition are known for their innovative strategies and shareholder engagement. Among their new asks this year are AI transparency report, the potential health harms of non-sugar substitutes, deep sea mining, fair treatment of shareholder nominees to the board, the impact of racial and ethnic disparities on business, adopting a living wage policy, net zero sector emissions alignment, proxy voting alignment, reducing microfiber pollution, anti-union expenditures, and still others. When investors file a resolution, companies may reach out to the filers for a dialogue and to discuss aspects of the proposal and find ways to address its requests. If an agreement between both parties is reached that satisfies the main asks of the proposal, filers may choose to voluntarily withdraw it. A few of the successful agreements reached this proxy season include Apple, risks of child online exploitation and abuse, Bank of Montreal, racial equity audit, Archer Daniels Midland, climate transition plan and GHG reduction targets, Starbucks, lobbying expenditures disclosure, Bristol Myers Squibb, human rights policy, and Thermo Fisher Scientific, ending sales of DNA testing kits in Tibet. So 42 resolutions, or just under 12% of all those filed by our members this year, have been challenged by companies at the SEC and are being reviewed by SEC staff. And this number is very similar to what we saw last year, which was 45 challenges at this time. To date, the proposals seeing the most challenges relate to corporate governance and climate change themes. And of course, it is still early in the proxy season, so we will keep you posted on the outcomes of these resolution challenges on our website, iccr.org, as information becomes available. And now we'll move on to our speakers. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Julie. Yes, on to our panelists. And we'll begin with Marcela Pinilla, Director of Sustainable Investing at Zevin Asset Management, who's going to discuss members' work to advance worker justice and move companies to take steps towards the paying of a living wage to their workers. Marcela.
Thank you, Susanna. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for the airtime on this issue. Our income disparity may be the starkest indicator of our societal failures to foster a more equitable society, and as a result, a more dynamic economy. As of 2022, the OECD ranks the US fourth from the bottom of the list of countries' income inequality gaps. Workers at the front lines, as we were painfully reminded in 2020 when the pandemic unleashed, are essential. They contribute to building tangible and intangible shareholder value. Yet there is abundant evidence that for a full-time employee earning $15 an hour, that's about $32,000 a year, this does not meet the income required to cover basic needs. A growing segment of the US population, about 95 million people, faces obstacles to a steady paycheck. Frontline hourly and salaried roles, such as retail salespeople, store managers, or healthcare workers, are a sizable group that is also among the most vulnerable in the workforce. They disproportionately work jobs that are characterized by limited workplace flexibility and mobility, low collective bargaining ability, and minimal, if any, health and financial benefits. They also experience the highest exposure to workplace hazards, to job stress, to employment volatility, and to exploitation. As companies increasingly hire more temporary workers from third-party staffing agencies, these disparities are exacerbated between direct employees and the contingent workforce. Through an intersectional gender and racial equity lens, we bring into focus that continued underinvestment in the workforce all but ensures that the economic participation of the most overrepresented group in the low-wage workforce, Black and Hispanic women, continues to be hindered. Long-term investments in the workforce foster reputational benefits for companies, as well as the recruitment and retention of motivated talent. A strong workforce is one where morale, motivation, and workplace standards are all upheld, not weakened. Economic research consistently shows that raising wages by $1 increases productivity, resulting in more than $1. Since higher wages, along with benefits, have shown to improve workplace and employee outcomes, investors want to know, how do companies balance the benefits of higher pay, lower turnover, higher worker effort, enhanced recruitment and retention, against the direct costs of higher compensation? That is a living wage. But addressing wage inequity in isolation misses the societal costs of suppressed wages. Companies that rely on a low-cost labor pool have a collective impact on the earnings of those 95 million workers. For example, a county-level analysis of wage changes for warehouse workers before and after Amazon's arrival reveals that average earnings for Amazon warehouse workers are lower in counties where Amazon does not operate. Finally, improved wages, policies, and practices also helps to ensure workers can afford basic needs and do not have to rely on government subsidies. Income-based inequality drives increased political polarization. It weakens trust in public institutions and undermines democratic processes, making this a relevant social and public policy issue. Further, inadequate pay puts downward pressure on the value of the global economy, which in turn affects investment portfolios, dragging down GDP growth. The systemic risk of inequality is further laid out in resolutions filed with major companies by the shareholder commons. Closing the living wage gap worldwide could generate as much as an additional $4.56 trillion every year through increased productivity and spending, which equates to more than 4% increase in annual GDP. A 2009 Goldman Sachs report found that increasing the income of people with lower wages has a disproportionately larger stimulating effect on the economy than increasing the income of those of already high incomes. As investors internalize the clear advantages of a diverse and resilient workforce, insight into living wage setting practices is a rational step. And one more thing, a quick revision from this Amazon study is that the earnings of warehouse workers on average were lower after Amazon arrives in those counties. And that's a study by NELP. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Marcela. Okay, we're going to move now to Laura Krause, Systems Director, Advocacy Programs at Common Spirit Health, who will discuss requests that healthcare companies view access to equitable and affordable healthcare as a human right. Laura.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here to speak with you today. Martin Luther King said, "Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhuman." For years now, investors have been engaging corporations on human rights, recognizing the significant legal, financial, regulatory, and reputational risks for a company that lacks human rights policies and a human rights due diligence process. These mechanisms help companies understand how their business practices are impacting human health and well-being. And without them, a company can be blind to negative influences and vulnerable to risks resulting from avoidable human rights violations. In 1948, the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights was released, listing 30 universally recognized rights that have provided a foundation for international conventions and agreements. The Declaration and its subsequent agreements speak to health as a human right by saying, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including medical care. And everyone has the right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Unfortunately, we don't live in a world that universally recognizes the human right to health. And when we evaluate the consequences of ignoring this right, we quickly uncover the vulnerability of our economic, social, and governmental systems. A 2018 American Heart Association report found that the price tag for heart disease and strokes in the US amounts to $363 billion annually in healthcare costs and lost productivity. Similarly, a 2017 report from the American Diabetes Association assessed those same costs for diabetes as $327 billion annually. But you know, these numbers are only part of the story. They do not demonstrate the human toll, lives lost too soon, livelihoods toppled for costs that could be significantly mitigated if only healthcare was viewed as a human right, available and accessible to all equally. These are the downstream impacts of a company's products and practices that ultimately will affect the company as investors and consumers recognize and attribute these human costs to corporate insensitivities. All proposals put forth this year by members of ICCR's Health Equity Working Group essentially address human rights. Now, some directly so, and some tangentially. Those directly addressing human rights seek corporate commitments from pharmaceutical manufacturers for the implementation of dedicated human rights policies and the assessment of human rights impacts. But other filings around patenting practices and disparities in health outcomes also fundamentally address human rights as they seek to hold companies accountable for practices that harm people due to unaffordable, inaccessible medicines and adverse health outcomes for marginalized and often disenfranchised populations. Companies will often tell investors that they abide by laws and regulations, therefore meeting various countries' human rights thresholds. But again, we don't live in a world where all governments have passed such laws. And in fact, it's fair to say that no government has been 100% successful in meeting the expectations of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And many governments simply refuse to recognize them entirely. So pharmaceutical companies and insurers, they're essential to health and access, and therefore essential to a thriving and equitable economy. With or without laws and regulations that affirm the human right to health, corporations have an obligation to set a higher bar. That said, let's be clear. With or without corporate commitments, laws and regulations are on their way. The upcoming EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and Corporate Social Due Diligence Directive will soon require enhanced human rights due diligence in the European market. So it only makes sense for companies to plan ahead for these directives and to streamline practices by making changes that are consistent across global markets. That's a responsible reaction, consistent with upholding shareholder value. Ultimately, corporations that make human rights commitments position themselves to address salient risks, but more importantly, they will have the opportunity to advance systemic change that will normalize a new way to think about health, transforming it from something some view as a privilege towards respecting it as a fundamental human right. Human rights commitments are simply a win-win scenario. Imagine a world that agrees that there is indeed a human right to health, where injustices and inequalities are absent, replaced with opportunities that are attainable for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. And now we'll hear from Pedro Enriquez da Silva, Director of the Shifting Trillions campaign at the Sierra Club Foundation, on their advocacy related to environmental justice. Pedro.
Thank you so much. Fiduciaries are entrusted with the proper management and care of the property of others. But all of that value is couched in the health of our natural and social systems. At the end of the day, many of us on this call are investors. And as investors, we're concerned with the same things that investors have always been concerned with, protecting and growing our assets. When you gain more information about the risks of pollution in communities or injustice in environmental outcomes, you need to factor that into your approach. Ignoring those risks is not only irresponsible, it's unobjective, it's ideologically biased, and it's a missed opportunity. Financial fiduciaries, who often have the most to lose, have been far too slow to recognize this. My name is Pedro, and I serve as a director for Shifting Trillions at the Sierra Club Foundation. Shifting Trillions refers to the role of capital in moving as quickly as possible towards the world we all deserve. Capital is not just money. It's the financial, relational, and intellectual resources that make things move. and its proper management affects our economy, it affects our society, the value of each and every asset in each and every corporation. In 2022, the United Nations acknowledged that a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a human right. This declaration highlighted a broader need for firms to understand and address their environmental justice risk. Here's what I mean by environmental justice risk. While industry's effects on climate have long taken center stage, its growing impact on health and on communities is attracting regulatory and international attention. Fossil fuels development, for example, has been linked to significantly elevated rates of cancers, especially leukemia, and to air, soil, and water contamination for nearby residents. These outcomes disproportionately affect children, workers, and people who are Black, Indigenous, or living in the global South. Even as companies seek to reduce disparities or abide by international human rights standards, many have not yet adequately assessed the regulatory, the reputational, and write-down risks related to these environmental justice concerns. And they're not theoretical. Just recently, pressure from a range of communities across the US led to a federal pause on permitting for liquid natural gas, LNG, exports, to understand the health and other risks involved. This puts financing for existing LNG development, in which several banks, including Goldman Sachs, are heavily entangled, in a precarious position. Meanwhile, focusing on advancing a clean energy transition alone doesn't actually address these concerns. The economic and workforce benefits of the energy transition accrue unequally along lines of race and ethnicity, even after controlling for education. Most minerals required for the clean energy transition are concentrated in the global South, where local people bear environmental harms associated with mineral extraction, and where climate change threatens the collapse of all production. That resultant civic unrest, the legislative and regulatory actions, the systemic risk of a failed transition can all lead to stranded assets and reputational harm. That's why several ICCR members have been engaging several US banks to elevate these risks. It's also why the Sierra Club Foundation is leading the filing of a resolution at Goldman Sachs to assess the material risks and opportunities related to the environmental justice impacts of its energy and power sector financing and underwriting. Because when these risks are not explicitly considered or accounted for, they threaten both the value and longevity of the business. They threaten the good name of the business, and they threaten surprises like the multi-billion-dollar question mark raised by the recent federal pause on LNG exports, uncertainty which banks like Goldman Sachs might have easily avoided by including explicit and robust environmental justice risk management in their environmental policy framework. Not explicitly considering these risks is irresponsible to the bank and to its shareholders. You can learn more by reaching out to me, and if you own bank shares, support our resolution this year at Goldman Sachs, as well as the resolutions of our colleagues at organizations like IASJ, who have filed at Wells Fargo, Citibank, and JP Morgan about Indigenous human rights risks. Whether you represent the management at one of these banks or are a personal or institutional shareholder, we urge your support, not because it's values-based, but because it's good and prudent financial management, because it's what it means to be a good financial fiduciary. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Pedro. And now we'll hear from Brandon Reese, Deputy Director, Corporations and Capital Markets for the AFL-CIO, who will discuss the importance of adopting an ethical framework for the management of risks related to the use of AI. Brandon.
Good morning. I want to thank ICCR for inviting me to speak today about the AFL-CIO Equity Index Fund's new shareholder proposals on artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence, or AI, is revolutionizing the future of business and work. This new technology promises to unleash broad-based prosperity, but it may also be used to de-skill and automate a wide variety of professions. AI technology also raises a number of human rights concerns. So for example, the use of AI in human resources decisions can result in employment discrimination and bias. And AI may be used in ways that violate the privacy of employees, customers, and members of the public. So to address these concerns, the AFL-CIO Equity Index Funds have introduced a new shareholder proposal that asks companies to issue an AI transparency report. This proposal asks companies to disclose their ethical guidelines that they have adopted regarding AI technology. We filed this proposal seeking an AI transparency report at a variety of entertainment companies, including Netflix, Comcast, and Warner Brothers Discovery, where AI has the potential to rapidly change the industry. We've received no action letter requests from Apple and Disney seeking the SEC's concurrence to exclude our proposal, but they were not successful in their no action request. We've since reached a withdrawal agreement with Disney, and the first vote on this new shareholder proposal will be at Apple on February 28th. Unlike other tech companies, Apple has not disclosed any ethical commitments specifically regarding AI technology and has not endorsed the White House's voluntary AI commitments that 15 other leading tech companies have already signed. By addressing the ethical considerations of AI in a transparent manner, companies can build trust among their stakeholders and contribute positively to society. Employees and other stakeholders need to have a voice in how AI technology is incorporated into business operations. Now, many tech companies have already made public commitments on their ethical use of AI. And for companies that are on the forefront of developing new AI technology, we believe that a committee of independent directors should be appointed to the board to manage the risks associated with AI. We believe that this board-level accountability is appropriate for tech companies that are actively developing AI, and our first proposal on this topic will be going to a vote at Amazon. For these reasons, we hope you will join us in urging companies to be mindful of the risks that AI creates. Both the transparent ethical guidelines and good corporate governance will help ensure that AI creates value for all company stakeholders and our society as a whole. Thank you for providing me the opportunity to speak today regarding our proposal, and please feel to contact me if I can provide you with any additional information regarding our AI shareholder proposal. Thanks. Back to you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Brandon. I just want to remind those of you in the audience, if you do have questions, to go ahead and submit them now into the question box so that they get into the queue. And finally, we're going to be hearing from Chirag Acharya, Senior Analyst, Sustainable Investment Stewardship at Westpath Investments and at Westpath Benefits and Investments, pardon me. And he'll be speaking about investor engagements related to business in conflict-affected and high-risk areas, or CARA. And I want to note that investor work related to the risks of AI that Brandon just spoke about, and also the work in conflict-affected areas is coordinated by the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. Okay, Chirag, you're up.
Thank you very much. I bet almost everyone on this call has a product made by Mondelez International in their kitchen. Mondelez owns brands such as Oreo, Cadbury, Sour Patch Kids, Ritz, and Wheat Thins. Hello, my name is Chirag Acharya, and I'm a senior analyst at Westpath Benefits and Investments. Westpath is an agency of the United Methodist Church and a shareholder in Mondelez. We invest on behalf of over 100,000 participants and more than 150 United Methodist-related institutions. This proxy season, Westpath filed a shareholder resolution in partnership with Heartland Initiative with Mondelez. We believe that investors would benefit from increased transparency and reporting on the company's management of material human rights risks, including those associated with their operations in Russia and Ukraine. These risks are not abstract. A Mondelez factory in eastern Ukraine was temporarily closed after sustaining significant damage by a Russian military attack. Mondelez has also generated approximately $173 million in tax revenue for the Russian state since the invasion of Ukraine. The resolution reflects our interest as a fiduciary in Mondelez, effectively managing exposure to human rights harms that pose material financial risks to the company. We believe it serves in shareholders' best interest to support this resolution. In the resolution, we talk about conflict-affected and high-risk areas. Conflict-affected and high-risk areas include places where armed conflict is taking place, such as Russia and Ukraine, Israel and Gaza, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm also referring to high-risk areas such as the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in China, where there are accusations of forced labor. These areas face heightened risks of human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The International Finance Corporation states that companies operating in these settings face business risks that are much greater than those in other emerging markets. The risks include deaths and injuries, destruction of assets, weak state control, and supply chain disruptions. The business risks of operating in conflict-affected and high-risk areas are greater, and thus the material financial risks are greater. Some of the material financial risks include regulatory risks, legal risks, operational risks, and reputational risks for all affected parties, including corporations and shareholders. Assessing a company's proximity to human rights risks and material financial risks in conflict-affected and high-risk areas, and how that company mitigates the associated impacts is crucial for rights holders, companies, and shareholders. Mondelez has a human rights policy which mentions the use of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. The United Nations Guiding Principles call on companies to conduct heightened human rights due diligence in conflict-affected and high-risk areas to prevent, address, and remedy human rights harms. Now, you might be asking, why is Westpath focusing on improving reporting on this topic at Mondelez? The fact is, Mondelez trails industry peers as it relates to responding to the heightened risk of operating in Russia. At a time when roughly 420 American companies have suspended business activities or exited completely from Russia, Mondelez's exposure to the region is significant and by some measures growing. Between April of 2022 and March of 2023, Mondelez increased overall shipments to Russia by 57%. Westpath's resolution asks the company to commission a third-party report to assess how well it has implemented its own human rights policy in conflict-affected and high-risk areas, including Russia and Ukraine. We're also asking for a third-party report to assess if additional policies, practices, and governance measures are needed to mitigate risks. Westpath is not the only shareholder concerned with how companies are operating in conflict-affected and high-risk areas. Other resolutions that address conflict-affected and high-risk areas for the upcoming proxy season have been filed at JP Morgan Chase, Lockheed Martin, Marriott, Raytheon, Texas Instruments, and TripAdvisor. If you are interested in hearing more about the connection between human rights and material financial risk, you can follow Westpath on LinkedIn or reach out to me directly on LinkedIn, and I will be happy to pass along a white paper that we are working on with partners at Heartland Initiative and Schroders on this very subject. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Chirag, and thanks to all our panelists. Okay, we're going to move now into the Q&A. I got an early question from Ulrich, and there might be the same question from others on the line in terms of how the proxy book can be used. It is a public resource as of today. It's been posted, and you are free to use the information within it. You can attribute it to ICCR if there are any charts or anything else that you're using. We would appreciate the attribution to ICCR, but it is public. Marcella, I have a question for you from Tim Smith. Can you please comment on how you plan to generate investor interest and awareness and support for your important resolutions?
Thank you for that question. Well, first, I think for members and anyone on this webinar who is an asset owner especially, have you looked at your manager's proxy voting policies lately? And do they have language on wage inequity types of proposals? I think racial equity audits rightfully have risen to the radars of many, which continue to be voted on a case-by-case basis. But these types of proposals are probably one of the most important issues in terms of the types of obstacles that we can lift and vote on. So I urge that sort of due diligence include under racial equity, these sorts of worker rights, access to collective bargaining and living wages as issues of racial equity. As I said, suppressed wages hinder economic participation, and structural racism is intertwined in this context as well. So I think we need to elevate the awareness of that intersectionality with so many issues that we're looking at, and removing the obstacles to progress for these 95 million workers really begins with wages. We've heard that from the horse's mouth. So this exercise will help us have visibility. I also think at the SEC level, we might hopefully have adoption of disclosure guidance along the lines of the number of employees that are part of the contingent workforce, where so much of the wage inequity happens. And this is not a new issue by any means, but we intend to continue these dialogues, and you'll probably begin to see it more regularly in proxy seasons as we encourage companies to go forward. We'll be presenting to Glass Lewis, to ISS, and urging pensions and managers and consultants and advisors to also put this on their radars, and equity and systemic risk, but also closing that equity gap so that all of the work we do can actually flow. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Marcela. This question is for Laura. Laura, are you working to make sure that pharma companies are looking at human rights throughout their business model and value chain, specifically access to their products and how that may be blocking the right to health for some?
Yes, that is exactly what we're trying to do. And we really believe that a human rights policy is the foundation for that. A company needs that, but then they also need to be able to take that foundational policy and assess it through a due diligence process. So, you know, when we're talking to companies, those two have to be present. And right now, I think what we see a lot of is companies that will say that they're looking at those kinds of human rights issues, but they're kind of looking at them through the lens of research and development, right? You know, it's so much about that and so much less about access. And that's where we see human rights risks. We often think upstream. I think with regard to human rights in general, we think very much upstream. We think supply chains, we think operations, but where we're really seeing human rights impacts is downstream. Can people access the medicines? Can they afford the medicines? What is the company doing to make sure that's clear? And when we look at something as simple as patent thicketing, which is a company where a company continues to take out more and more patents on the same drug, we really see impaired access for people. It keeps drugs that are innovative and life-saving so highly priced that the regular person may not be able to afford them. You know, there's many problems that are going to arise from that, right? And generics aren't going to enter because the pharmaceutical companies then set a new standard of care, right? And so that standard of care then makes doctors not prescribe. I mean, it's a huge, huge, intricately woven mess, truthfully. And pharmaceutical companies don't have those due diligence processes in place so that they can truly assess from stem to stern what is going on, where do we have the risks, where are we actually having adverse impacts, and without really knowing that, they will never be able to fully address them. I hope that's answered the question.
Thanks, Laura. That's great. I have a question for Brandon from Rob 4 of the Presbyterian Church. Brandon, which industries are adopting AI into their business operations?
Thanks, Susanna. That's a great question. So the risks created by AI are not just a tech industry issue. Almost all companies are moving to adopt AI if they haven't already done so. They're looking at it for automating their human resources decisions, their customer service, their product creation and delivery. There's just a tremendous amount of potential applications of this new technology. Now, some of this might be window dressing, trying to capture the stock price premium that's associated with AI right now. But almost all companies are at least considering how AI may be incorporated into their business models. On our Executive Paywatch website, which is at www.paywatch.org, we look at the highest paid CEOs and what they're doing regarding artificial intelligence. Almost every single company that we looked at was working on adopting AI in some form. And this includes a wide breadth of different types of companies, such as the private equity firm Blackstone, tech companies like Alphabet, the rental car company Hertz, the exercise equipment maker Peloton, and the entertainment company Live Nation. So This affects almost all industries, almost all companies, and investors need to be attentive to this risk. And so we hope that you will support our shareholder proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Chirag, this is for you. One reason Mondelez provides for remaining in Russia is that it provides essential goods and services. Is that a legitimate argument for staying? By staying, how is Mondelez contributing to the Russian war effort?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So to the first part of that question, I would state that there are many of its industry peers that have left as well that provide these kind of food and beverage consumer products in Russia. So I would not say that that would be a legitimate, answer from the company. For the second part, in regard to how can the company potentially be contributing to fueling Russia's war? Well, the Russian state actually ordered a partial mobilization. It's an order that requires companies to facilitate the conscription of staff to provide support to the military. The company actually employs about 3,000 employees in Russia. So we do not know the extent of how many of those employees are now in the Russian military fighting in Ukraine.
Great, Chirag. Okay. Pedro, this is one for you. Actually, there was another question. If you wouldn't mind just repeating again the banks that are receiving the proposal on environmental justice for someone who's on the line. And another question, did you have conversations with companies about biodiversity in the past year? And are there any proposals on biodiversity this year?
Yeah, both great questions. So for the other banks that are receiving, related proposals, the only bank that's receiving our proposal is Goldman Sachs. With the other banks, we have engaged in productive dialogue thus far, and we'll be glad to share some of the results of that in the coming months. As for where our colleagues have filed resolutions that are similar, those banks, to my knowledge, are Wells Fargo, Citi, and JP Morgan. As for biodiversity, that's something that we discuss as part of our ongoing environmental justice engagement with a variety of financial institutions, banks, and asset managers included. We haven't filed a specific resolution on biodiversity. Most of our focus this year has been on environmental justice and health.
Thanks, Pedro. Marcella, this one's for you. What have been the company objections to the living wage proposals? In essence, where was the gap in getting to a withdrawal?
It's all in flux right now. Like many emerging issues, because we have put it back on the table, issues, there's really a wish to understand what the process is. They understand what the outcome is. We want companies to long-term adopt living wage practices and policies. So far, I've had a conversation with the Home Depot about this. I should say both Amazon and the Home Depot have filed petitions with the SEC to omit the proposal. I did speak with the Home Depot in one of our first discussions, and they really wanted to understand, okay, so across counties, county level, we use because that's how the MIT living wage calculator and other frameworks are zoning in, and understanding their prevailing wages, that they're not enough, even though all of these companies have recently made announcements, including Kroger, of investment in their workforce. It's not enough. And the idea of finding that delta between county level wages and Home Depot wages and or Amazon wages is to understand, how wide is that gap? The opposition statements, arguments are ordinary business. But we are pretty sure that our arguments will get through. Other proposals have gotten through on living wage. So I'm sanguine about that. But we have yet to speak with Amazon, who preemptively has posted up a page on wage practices. So that is still we'll see what the outcome of that is.
Great, thank you. Laura, this is for you. How should US-based pharma companies be preparing for the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and the Corporate Sustainability? Yes, that's it, the same one.
Yeah.
CS triple D.
CS triple D, yes. They better be paying attention, that's for sure, because they are coming. So I think those companies who have been mindful of the UN Declaration of Human Rights and business and human rights will be better prepared, honestly. But the best thing our US companies could do right now, because they all pretty much operate in the EU, so this will apply to them, they need that human rights policy. And they have to have a due diligence process in place. They have to at least beginning of thinking about these things. And it can't be an internal auditing process either. Really has to be third party. We see over and over again, just from dialogues for over many years, that the companies can't necessarily be objective about themselves. There are blind spots. They must have someone else assessing this for them, because there are going to be great implications if they just, if they miss this, and if they find they are violating human rights and they're not taking adequate steps to address them. There are the corporate, financial, reputational risks that they will incur. And so they have to be ready to go now, and now is the best time to start. It would make no sense for them to think about how this applied in Europe and say, well, but we can practice elsewhere differently. That makes no sense. That's a waste of their dollars and our dollars, truthfully, as investors.
Great. A reminder to everyone to please put your questions into the question box. So raising hands, we're not really going to be acknowledging, just type your questions in the question box. Chirag and others, a question from Graham Sinclair. Excuse me. I appreciate the investor questions for portfolio companies like Westpath's for Mondelez. Please may the presenter and ICCR comment on how similar investment case has been made to other brand-dependent food and beverage sector companies still funding Russian Federation's war on Ukraine and other territories. Chirag, maybe you want to start with that one, and if anybody else wants to jump in.
Yeah, and I also welcome any of my ICCR colleagues to help answer this question. I would just state that similar investment case to other brands, other food brands, I would just say that Mondelez is the prime example of a food and beverage company still operating in Russia, whereas their other industry peers have either partially left or have completely withdrawn from Russia. So I would just state that by those actions, we see that these companies are assessing the various risks related to operating and continuing operations in Russia. And so I will just leave it at that, and I'll welcome any of my ICCR colleagues for their input on this question.
Anybody else want to weigh in there? And my ICCR colleagues, go ahead and feel free to post a comment if you want to respond. It, as in the question box, just respond it as a comment, and I'll go ahead and read it to everyone. Chirag, there are some comments and questions here that are related to the extension of your work in terms of companies' responsibilities in Kara geographies and the war in Israel-Palestine, Israel-Hamas war. I don't know if you want to comment on that, or if anybody else on the panel wants to say anything regarding that.
Yeah, what exactly was the question?
You speak to the successes you've had in moving change on corporate practices related to conflict areas and how these lessons how can these lessons be extended to the war in Gaza and companies with involvement?
Yeah, we just encourage asset owners and asset managers and other stakeholders to implement a kind of non-biased macro perspective on conflict-affected high-risk area risk. And so therefore, what we're seeing in Gaza and Israel is unfortunately, it's a very unfortunate situation that we're seeing at this point in time. And we do continue on engaging with our own internal stakeholders on this situation. And we try to engage with companies on these risks, not only in Israel and Gaza, but other areas where we have identified as conflict-affecting high-risk areas. And so we'll continue on engaging with our portfolio companies and with our asset managers on these various issues, especially related to the continuing war in Gaza.
Terrific. One more question, the last question for today. So this is, I think, really for, hold on, Laura. Regarding a pharma human rights policy, is the spirit of this focused on low middle income countries, or is there an aspect of this that includes US, European citizens, human rights, and inequalities here?
Yes, to all. Yes, I mean, that should be, it shouldn't be focused in any one particular sort of population or country. I mean, we have to be mindful globally. Now is the time to be mindful globally. I think the risks of not being mindful of all of the markets that a company is in leaves a company extremely vulnerable to risks. And honestly, it leaves people vulnerable to risks and planet. And so now is not the time to sort of segment out and say, and companies like to do that, by the way. They like to talk about what they're doing in the lower income countries, middle income countries. This has to be global. That is in the best interest of the company. And it's really, again, just wise business. Why have policies that only apply in some places? This is a human rights issue. It is about the human right to health.
Terrific. And I think we're going to have to leave it there, everybody. A great, robust conversation happening in the questions box there, but we will get back to you. I will field all the questions to the panelists so they can respond directly to those unanswered questions. Thank you to our panelists today who did such a fantastic job. Wonderful. And I just wanted to remind everybody that a link to the proxy book is being mailed shortly, very, very soon, along with the recording, including the Q&A here today. And we also just want to remind everybody the importance of remaining active owners of our stocks and exercising our rights as shareholders by voting our proxies. Thank everybody for joining us today, and have a terrific day. Okay, bye.